see where your uric acid is and see how it responds. The step one is fructose by far and away, and it is everywhere. Again, 65% of America's foods have added sweetener, and by and large, there's hidden fructose in just about everything in a package these days.
What is uric acid, and what's its relation to disease, inflammation, things that we want to avoid?
Well, it turns out that uric acid is a central player in metabolism, in regulating metabolism and balancing our metabolism. And why that matters is because our most dreaded conditions are at their core metabolic. They're a manifestation of metabolic mayhem, if you will, which in our modern world is absolutely rampant. I have to admit, I just flew in yesterday back to my home in Florida from Las Vegas, and I haven't been in an airport for a while, and it was breathtaking just to have that cross section of what Americans are now looking like. And certainly the pandemic with the stress and lockdown, et cetera, didn't help things along. But at the core of what we dread most, be it Alzheimer's, diabetes, coronary artery disease, and even some forms of cancer, are metabolic derangements, meaning elevation of our blood sugar, elevation of our blood pressure, elevation of our belly size, dyslipidemia, meaning elevation of our bad cholesterol versus good, and things like elevation of triglycerides. So we really need to rein in our metabolism and recognize, well, what are those factors? And, Max, I have to tell you, this is what you and I have been talking about for many, many years. What are the factors that are messing up our metabolism? And so many lifestyle factors are at play. And certainly the foods that we eat are paramount in this equation. And I had the opportunity to look through the recipes in your new book, or some of them. And I'm really happy to say how dialed in they are in terms of being designed to target better metabolism. That's the key to a longer, healthier life that is resistant to disease. So uric acid.
Yes, for years we've been talking about uric acid, but really only in the context of gout. The question is, what does it mean when you go to the doctor and he or she says, well, your uric acid level is in the so-called normal range, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but that basically means that you have a lower risk for that disease, gout. But we now recognize that this uric acid has far broader implications than just gout.
It is a danger signal. It is telling our bodies to make and store fat, to raise our blood pressure, to make more blood sugar, because probably tomorrow we're going to start starving. We're going to be at risk for food scarcity. And therefore, this elevation of uric acid that we as humans and other great primates has been a powerful survival mechanism until only recently, first with the development of agriculture, which really paved the way for food security. And then more recently with the advent of the refinement of corn to make high fructose corn syrup. And fructose, when it's metabolized, becomes uric acid and tells the body winter is coming, make fat. So this is powerful new information, a tool in our toolbox that we never had before. We've known since 1970 in the Lancet that fructose is messing us up in terms of our metabolism, but we never understood exactly how that happens. What are the mechanisms? And now that researchers like Dr. Richard Johnson at University of Colorado have identified this role of uric acid and why we as humans have as much as 4 times as much uric acid as other mammals, because it was a survival mechanism, it makes us realize that context is everything. In the context of food scarcity, hey, great that we have this mutation that causes us to have higher uric acid. But in the context of so much sugar and fructose specifically in our lives, it's killing us. And it allows us a new tool. Keeping uric acid levels in check allows us to rein in the fat production, inflammation, free radical mediated stress, increased blood sugar, insulin resistance, all the components of what we call the metabolic syndrome, which underlie just about every chronic disease condition that we don't want to get.
Yeah. You've always been ahead of the curve. It was a decade now at this point almost that you blew the whistle on refined grains, and specifically what refined grains can do to the health of our brains. And you were very much ahead of the curve on that. And what gluten can do in the context of our GI tract and how that can cause a cascade that can influence brain health potentially. So why now uric acid?
Well, I think my mission has been to do my very best to give people information about how they can optimize their metabolism. Because again, these metabolic derangements that are so pervasive, 88% of American adults have at least one component of the metabolic syndrome. That means only 1 in 8 American adults is metabolically intact. 50% of American adults, that's the number by 2030. And 2030 is not in the distant future. That's just around the corner. So that, 1/3 of Americans is obese. 74% of American adults right now is obese or at least overweight. And, the reason for me to put out a book like Drop Acid is to be a doctor. The term doctor means teacher. It doesn't mean healer. It means teacher. It means giving information so then people who avail themselves of that information can make the changes to regain health and help stave off disease. And, dare I need you tell you that these neurodegenerative conditions are challenging. You have been there, and I have been there in terms of having a parent. And I've certainly, with 35 years of clinical practice dealing with things like Alzheimer's, have been seeking out what we can do to let the world know that there are things that can happen, choices we can make to reduce our risk of these devastating issues, for which we have no meaningful treatment, I might add, despite the release of drugs that target this beta amyloid. We saw how that recently played out. It didn't. So the mission is to be preventive on the front end and really keep people cognitively healthy with respect to all aspects of their metabolism. Turns out that uric acid is yet another tool. We published Grain Brain, as you say, almost a decade ago, 2013. And at that point, the data was becoming very clear that people had a dramatic increased risk of Alzheimer's if their blood sugar was even slightly elevated at 105, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, knowing that becoming a type 2 diabetic can as much as quadruple a person's risk for Alzheimer's and untreatable disease, made me really want to concentrate on getting this word out that, folks, you need to get your blood sugar in check. That's job one. Yeah, we want to keep our waistlines reduced. We want to manage our blood pressure as well. Definitely want to exercise to increase the growth of new brain cells, all the things. But I think the biggest issue are the metabolic problems that are so rampant in our society that represent a mismatch between our evolution and our environment. That evolutionarily, these things that changed in our metabolism, the increased body fat, the increased blood sugar, the increased blood pressure, were powerful survival tools. That's why it was selected out 14 million years ago for us, our ancestors, and then Paleolithic ancestors, to have higher uric acid levels, because it allowed them to survive during times of food and water scarcity. And now, of course, we see this huge mismatch because we don't need the activation of those pathways to make fat, to tell our bodies to prepare for the winter that never comes, because, we're consuming fructose, the powerful inroad to this whole cascade, 365 days a year. When you see 60 to 70% of the labeled foods in grocery stores having added sweeteners, and by and large, those are either pure fructose or high fructose corn syrup derivatives, it's no mystery. Now that we understand how fructose does its dirty work through uric acid, it's no mystery that health is in general just going down the tubes.
It really is. So, uric acid, the subject of your new book, Drop Acid, it's going to be probably a new term for many people listening. You mentioned that as a physician, you were taught about it mostly in the context of the disease state gout. But what do we currently know about uric acid, its role in the body? And then I want to get into, the diet and lifestyle factors that are able to modulate levels of uric acid in the body.
So uric acid, let's take a step back, is a danger signal. It's alerting our body. It's sounding an alarm saying we better start making fat because winter's coming and food scarcity is going to be an issue, and water scarcity as well. And I definitely want to get into the water scarcity part because that relates to how uric acid increases blood pressure. So what triggers uric acid are things that perhaps would be seasonal. For example, that would come before the winter, before we'd be slogging through the snow looking to find a tuber or a dead animal or who knows what. And what happens in the late summer and in the early fall? Fruit ripens. And our ancestors and primate ancestors as well would eat fruit because it was sweet. And that's the reason that everybody on the planet, you and me included, have a sweet tooth. You know, people say, oh, I don't have a sweet tooth. Or it's one thing to say, I choose not to eat sweets. That's not talking about your deepest drive to eat sugar. That comes from a more primordial part of your brain that is, fundamental for survival. You can choose not to eat sweet. That's having your more advanced prefrontal cortex be the adult in the room, say, yeah, you can eat cupcakes all day, but that's not our choice because we want to live a long and healthy life. So in the context then of our ancestors, this danger signal, uric acid, the downstream manifestation of the metabolism of fructose, and also purines, which come from meat, for example, organ meats, and also from alcohol. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's not all alcohol that is threatening. This is a signal that plays upon our metabolism to, in the liver, increase what is called gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis, the new production of sugar. Why? Because sugar powers the brain, and that's our high card. That is how we avoid two things, starvation and predation. So we can find food because we're clever enough to know how to get food, and don't get eaten by another animal. That's, at least historically, why we would need to make glucose from the other components in our bodies, amino acids, breaking down protein, to power the brain to allow us to get out of trouble. We're not the strongest, we're not the fastest animal in the forest, but maybe we're the smartest, who knows? So in that context, then, we recognize that what uric acid is doing is fanning the flames of this increased sugar production and also increasing our body's retention of water, ultimately, so that we can avoid being dehydrated. And as such, it does raise blood pressure, which would have been a good thing in the day. Nowadays, not so much, as they say. So that's what uric acid does. These powerful mechanisms within the liver and elsewhere in the body that really deeply affect our metabolism. What uric acid does, along with the metabolism of fructose, a little bit technical here, but we have two ways of metabolizing something called AMP. And what AMP is the downstream end product of our energy consumption. Our energy is stored as ATP. When ATP loses a phosphate group, it becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate. ATP has 3, ADP has 2, down to AMP, adenosine monophosphate. That's just 1. Every loss of this phosphate, when it breaks apart from the adenosine backbone, releases energy to how we power our bodies. Interestingly, fundamentally, the metabolism of fructose consumes ATP down to AMP. That's so different from how we metabolize glucose, for example. And as such, it's an energy lowering process, but it's also important because that, along with uric acid, shifts our metabolism from, there are two pathways. And here's the nerdy part for all the nerds who are watching right now.
We love
myself.
it.
We have two major pathways in the body. One is when we're out doing stuff, using energy, tapping into our fat resources, keeping our blood sugar normal. That is brought about by activating something called AMPK. On the other hand, AMP can be metabolized through a totally different pathway called AMP deaminase. When we activate AMP deaminase, that's telling our bodies that we either need to get ready for winter or we're going to hibernate. If you're a bear getting ready to hibernate, you're packing in the fructose, eating the berries, your AMP deaminase is on fire. You are making fat, you are storing fat, and your metabolic rate is reduced. So you're not burning calories. Well, obviously, we want to keep AMP kinase activated because AMP kinase says, hey, we're going to burn fat, we're not going to store fat, and we're sure as heck not going to make more blood sugar because we just don't need it. Everything is fine. Uric acid shuts that off. And that is fundamental. Uric acid
prepares your body for hibernation
by shutting off AMP kinase. We want AMP kinase to be active. That's how the drug metformin works. Matter of fact, the diabetes drug metformin targets AMP kinase and as such reduces how much blood sugar is made in the liver. So it's a diabetes drug. You can activate AMP kinase by taking quercetin, by exercising, by using berberine, for example. A lot of different ways to activate AMP kinase, but you certainly don't want to shut it down. And that is really the nuts and bolts about the dirty work done by elevated uric acid, far beyond making gout crystals in our toes. That's for sure.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, AMP kinase, otherwise known as AMPK, stimulated by high intensity exercise, stimulated by intermittent fasting. So for all we know, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it seems to be a biochemical fountain of youth in a sense, but it's this AMP.
In the context of our modern life. Now, understand that in the context of our ancestors, in other words, in the context of 99.99% of our time on this planet, there'd be important times that you'd want to wait and you'd want to have a higher blood sugar and you'd want to be storing fat away because you might not have water available to you in the future.
Very interesting. So high levels of uric acid, otherwise known as hyperuricemia, right? Do we know for sure whether or not that's a cause or effect of disease at this point?
Yeah. And in fact, that's been the, kind of a central point of research for the past decade where, it started with laboratory animals, with rodents, where a Dr. Richard Johnson, who at that time was at University of Florida, then moved to University of Colorado. He had rodents and he was studying hypertension, high blood pressure, and he could get them to be hypertensive by feeding them fructose. And immediately they'd become hypertensive. And interestingly, they would gain weight and demonstrate other aspects of metabolic syndrome. Ultimately, through a series of circumstances, he learned that in addition, when he fed them fructose, that the uric acid levels would go up. And he puzzled over that and finally said that, wondered if in fact uric acid may be playing a role. And he administered to these laboratory animals a drug called allopurinol, which is a common gout medicine. We use it in treating gout. It brings uric acid down because it blocks the final enzymes, antioxidants, which makes uric acid from fructose and alcohol and purines. And lo and behold, they didn't get metabolic issues. Their blood pressure didn't go up, et cetera. And that put a light bulb on in his head. And he ultimately demonstrated in adolescents, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that he could, in obese adolescents with mild elevations of the uric acid, he could reduce their blood pressure by giving them a uric acid blocking drug, and then performed a study in which he gave adult men a very high dosage of fructose for several weeks. And they, an abundance of them developed metabolic syndrome in the untreated group, and the group that got the allopurinol did not.
Wow. So
it really tended to tease out exactly that question that you just asked. There was an article written in 2016 in the a collaborative study or paper that came out of, I think, Japan and Turkey, where they said uric acid in metabolic syndrome from innocent bystander to central player. So, yeah, we've been seeing that. Hey, it turns out that obese people, hypertensives, people with metabolic syndrome, they all seem to have an elevated uric acid. We asked the same question that you just asked. Is that just cause or effect? And we now know that it is indeed this central player, because therapies that target uric acid without necessarily tinkering with other parts of metabolism bring about metabolic improvement. So it's a brand new tool in the toolbox. And it's also, I think, a brand new metric in the panel of metabolic health, like blood pressure, blood sugar, A1C, waist size, body mass index. Uric acid, I think, rightfully should have its place in those incredibly important biometrics.
I always love talking to you because you really bring the science, Dr. Perlmutter. It's, I think, one of the reasons why over the years, I've followed your work so closely. So how do you reconcile then? Because uric acid, like many chemicals in the body, if not all chemicals in the body, play many roles, right? And so there is some truth, I think, to the fact that it also plays a role as an antioxidant. And I'm sure because you're a neurologist, there's this interesting connection between uric acid levels and Parkinson's disease, right? People with low levels of uric acid seem to be at higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease, and levels of uric acid continue to decline as symptoms worsen in Parkinson's disease. So there seems to be this protective effect of uric acid on the brain. How do you reconcile all that with all the research
That's really
that you've
an
done?
Excellent question. And I would say that for a couple of years, maybe 15 years ago, when that literature was published, I actually was treating my patients to raise their uric acid levels, thinking that it was, acting as an antioxidant. Maybe it would be helpful if we raise their uric acid levels, how things change. And interestingly, about 4 months ago in the Journal of the American Medical Association was an interesting article where they did basically the same thing. And they found that, in fact, raising uric acid was of no benefit to Parkinson's, and in fact was possibly associated with worsening. So wow. It was an observation that there was, this issue with uric acid, and that, it may have to do with metabolism. Now, as it relates to the notion of a really low uric acid being somewhat neuroprotective, I think that is an observational study in kind of end stage individuals with Alzheimer's, and the uric acid levels can be really low. And I think you have to understand that uric acid is made not just from fructose, but also from the breakdown of muscle tissue. And once people are really moving along on that continuum of cognitive decline, they tend to atrophy, they tend to lose muscle mass. So there's not really this resource for making purines and then making uric acid in their bodies. So, that 2/3 of the purines in your body that form uric acid are not dietary. They're being it's coming from the breakdown, which we all do. Hopefully, it's a good thing to break down your protein. It's part of, breaking down cellular components to recycle them, et cetera. So that's, it's very interesting. I think that
the data on uric acid in terms of its antioxidant function, as it may relate to things like Parkinson's, doesn't really seem to be panning out.
Yeah, very, very. I'm glad that you clarified, because you're right. It was an observation. It's always possible that, when you see those two variables, that the disease state of Parkinson's is causing the drop in uric acid, not that the drop in uric acid is, causing the disease state that we call Parkinson's disease. So thank you for clarifying. So I want to talk about the dietary factors that can increase or decrease uric acid in the body. You've already brought up fructose. So what are some of the foods that we want to be really sort of weary of when it comes to increasing our risk for hyperuricemia, high uric acid levels? What are some?
Well, did I mention fructose yet?
You mentioned fructose.
That's by far and away.
Okay.
Fructose is the biggest player, the fructose that we eat. And, certainly there are other foods that we'll talk about, but let me not get off of fructose quite yet. There's one other really interesting sidelight to that. And that is, yes, it's the fructose that we consume, but it's also the fructose that we make in our bodies. So we actually can manufacture fructose in our bodies from glucose. It's called the polyol pathway. And think about it, higher levels of glucose can be shuttled into making more fructose, which tells the body it's time to get ready for winter. And who has high glucose? Well, pre-diabetics, diabetics, Glucose levels across the board seem to be rising in our population. So we have this pathway to actually produce fructose in our bodies as yet another mechanism to prepare for winter. And it can be brought on by having high levels of glucose. It is also brought on by either dehydration or the sense of dehydration. When you are dehydrated, what happens? Your sodium levels go up. Now, this is really important. So you're dehydrated, your sodium levels go up. It triggers the formation of fructose. That makes body fat, and you can convert body fat into water. Survival mechanism. The other thing to consider, though, is so if your body is sensing the sodium level when you're dehydrated, eating a lot of salt, eating a lot of sodium without adding water raises your serum sodium level. And what does that do? It makes you fat. That is the connection, because sodium turns on this pathway. Aldose reductase is the enzyme that is involved in converting glucose into fructose. Fructose then, through uric acid, stimulates the production of body fat. So we have the production of body fat, which then can serve as a source of water for our ancestors. But for us, it's not doing us any good. I mean, I think it's so important to think about storing body fat as a survival mechanism during times of water scarcity, a powerful survival mechanism. The camel's hump isn't filled with water. There's no, 10-gallon water tank in the camel's hump. It's fat. And as that camel makes his way or her way across the desert, fat, gram for gram, as it's metabolized, is creating fresh water in that, like the blue whale. That's where they get their fresh water. Who knew? So the storage of fat is a survival mechanism, yes, as a resource of calories, but also to keep us hydrated so that we don't perish from dehydration.
Wow. I'll never think of whales and camels the same way again. Not that I thought about camels too often to begin with, but that is fascinating.
Yeah, but you got to wonder what the heck was that hump all about, right?
Yeah.
You got to wonder. I'll tell you something else that puzzled me for an awful long time. Now that we're talking about things that we hadn't thought about, that humans don't make vitamin C, and you can't just write that off. You got to think about that for a minute. Well, yeah. So that does it mean it? So therefore, it sucks to be human. We have to always eat fruit and or take a vitamin C. That's the fix. Well, why would it obviously be advantageous for us not to make vitamin C?
I'm stumped.
Right. But it's got to be one of those things you think of when you're falling asleep at night. Vitamin C does a couple of things. Yes, it is an antioxidant. And therefore, without vitamin C, free radicals will be increased. And that is a powerful mitochondrial event to increase our fat production, allowing us to survive. And here's the other thing about vitamin C. Higher levels, if we made vitamin C, higher levels would cause us to excrete more uric acid. And that would compromise our ability to make fat. That's why vitamin C is on the program as in terms of what we recommend for uric acid.
Wow, optimizing for vitamin C. So we know to avoid fructose, but is it to avoid all fructose? I mean, whole fruit has fructose in it, right? Fructose derives fruit sugar is fructose essentially. It's some combination of fructose and glucose. But are you suggesting to avoid fruit or what? So what is the prescription?
I'm really glad you asked that question so I can be so clear. I am absolutely not suggesting that. So the context, what is the context in which that fructose is delivered? It's delivered with some very important things. Bioflavonoids that we've already talked about that can act like the drug allopurinol, fiber to slow fructose absorption, and finally, just talked about it, vitamin C. So it turns out that eating fruit, though it may contain 5 or 10 grams of fructose, is not associated with activating this pathway, with elevation of uric acid. Now, can you overdo it? Yes, you can. I mean, if you're a bear getting ready to hibernate, you're going to be eating pounds and pounds of berries all day long, keeping AMP deaminase turned on, suppressing AMP kinase, and building as much fat as you possibly can so you can survive hibernation. I'll give you another example. AMP deaminase is dramatically activated in the hummingbird. Who knew? The hummingbird is one of the fattest animals on the planet. That's right. 40% at times of a hummingbird's body weight can be fat. What does if you want hummingbirds in your backyard, what do? You put out a feeder. What do you fill it with? Sugar water. And they go crazy. That's their key to make fat. The fat is a calorie resource and a water resource. So then they can fly from north to south, the thousands of miles, the epic journeys that they have, because they've made enough body fat to make that happen.
Fascinating. You also recently on social media, you gave this big grandiose apology.
I know where we're going with this. Go ahead, honey.
Yeah. Go ahead, honey. You apologized to honey. What is that about? Honey, I think is a source of fructose. Is it not?
And all that glitters isn't gold. And, I've been knocking honey for a very long time, simplistically because it does contain, a significant amount of sugar and fructose in specific. And I concluded, therefore, it's bad for metabolic health. Well, that's not what the science said. The science said that my conclusions or my assumptions were not correct. So I did post, I'm sorry, honey. And everybody thought it was a public apology to my wife. So it went crazy, which was funny. But it turns out that for whatever reason, is it, certain bioflavonoids in honey or whatever it may be, that honey has some positive good effects on metabolic health. Now, that doesn't mean you can drink a bottle of honey, but it means if you want to use a teaspoon of honey in creating something, maybe in your tea, whatever it may be, that I don't see it threatening. I thought it was, and I was convinced it was, but I apologize, honey. I was wrong.
Well, you famously said, I'll always remember, this is one of your many great quotes. I don't care if you get your honey from bees that were meditating under the something in an ashram in India,
That's right. It's still sugar.
Yeah, it's still sugar. But
I think that it's important now that we're seeing such good science that allows us not to be so global and that can be a little bit more specific. When we say certain foods are bad because of X, well, I think it's time to deconstruct a little bit. And A, and B, I think it's also valuable to be comfortable in changing your messaging based upon science. People tend to criticize Dr. Perlmutter because I said 30 years ago, I was saying, a low-fat diet is really the way to go, because that's all the messaging we got. That's what all of our science was telling us, that we need to cut dietary fat. We learn differently. And then we learned the dirty little secret behind why all of the science was telling us that we should not eat dietary fat and eat more sugar in the day. And that's a horrible story. And, but we move forward. We're going to look at the light and not look at the darkness, light that single candle. But I think importantly, it's really necessary to keep following the science. And if that science reveals that some of your messaging needs to be challenged from the past, then so be it. And I think people should appreciate that rather than, be negative towards that.
I absolutely do appreciate that. So in my eyes, you're the real deal. But one sweetener that you don't hold any punches on in the book is a sweetener that I think a lot of people use because it does tend to have a health halo around it, and that is agave syrup.
Well, just look at the data. Agave is at least 70% fructose, and there is nothing good about agave, though they call it nectar. Go to any health food store and get a tea or coffee, and they'll direct you to the area where you can have your artificial sweeteners, cane sugar, and then of course the choice is agave. And they shouldn't be doing that. I mean, there may come a time, and I say, Max, looks like there's some great data on agave, but I've not seen it. When I see it, I'll apologize to agave too, and but I haven't seen that, so I still remain very negative towards agave.
I think it tends to get a pass because it's marketed as having a low glycemic index, which is deceiving.
Yes, well,
because
fructose has a glycemic index of around 19, pure fructose. So I think we need to move away from the glycemic index. Fructose in the day was the sugar of choice promoted by diabetes groups because it does not activate insulin or need insulin, rather, to be metabolized. Therefore, hey, if it's not involving insulin, it sure as heck's not going to cause diabetes. Nothing could be further from the truth. Though it doesn't require insulin for its metabolism, it directly stimulates gluconeogenesis. So it raises blood sugar. And what does that do? That raises insulin and ultimately can lead to insulin resistance. And I'll give you another mechanism, which I think is really interesting. And that is that fructose, by causing elevation of uric acid, compromises the action of a chemical in the body called nitric oxide. So fructose consumption reduces how nitric oxide works. Two important jobs of nitric oxide in the human body are, number one, it allows blood vessels to open up and relax. It helps with blood flow. It's the reason that drugs to increase nitric oxide are used for erectile dysfunction, as an example. But we don't want our blood vessels constricted anywhere in the heart, in the brain, in the kidneys. Obviously, that's not a good thing. So that is the relationship between giving somebody high fructose diet and creating high blood pressure, which can be blocked if you give them a drug that blocks the production of uric acid. Uric acid compromises how nitric oxide does its magic. There's one other thing I'll tell you about nitric oxide. Get us back to our original conversation. Nitric oxide is needed for insulin to get out of the blood vessel and into where it's needed, the muscle cells and the liver cells. Nitric oxide facilitates that. When we reduce or downregulate the effectiveness of nitric oxide because uric acid levels are elevated, we stop or reduce how insulin does its job. We contribute to insulin resistance, the harbinger for type 2 diabetes. So then getting back to something you mentioned earlier, well, is uric acid just elevated, because they're diabetic? In a sense, yes. And we can talk about that. But in another sense, as I just described, it's contributing to it. It's causing it. It's a central player.
Wow. Shocking. And agave syrup, as you mentioned, being upwards of 70% fructose is probably even worse with respect to your uric acid levels than high fructose corn syrup. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, high fructose corn syrup, even though the name would suggest that it's very high in fructose, it tends to be only about 50% fructose, 50% glucose. Am I mistaken?
What's that? 55% fructose and about 42% glucose. There are, other things in high fructose corn syrup, but, that was produced originally it was developed in 1957, the method of extracting high fructose corn syrup from corn. And that proved to be an incredible event because the extraction process was very simple and produced a sweetener that's far sweeter than just table sugar, than sucrose, and cheaper. And so no longer do we need to depend on cane sugar coming in from Cuba. We would be able to make sugar from corn to the extent that now the United States government subsidizes corn production to the tune of $500 billion a year. Much of that going to the production of high fructose corn syrup. And, the food recommendation, nutritional recommendations that come out every 5 years, 2020 until 2025, that came out in 2020 from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, despite all the science that was given to them, said that it's still cool to have 10% of your daily calorics consumption coming from sugar. 10%. No scientist told the committee that voted on that that was reasonable. So with Dr. Casey Means, we wrote an op-ed in MedPage today, which was an open letter to President Biden saying, hey, I know we're familiar with this, that, these are every 5 years, but we need to rein this into at maximum 6% of our total calories. There is no human requirement for dietary sugar at all these days. Would it have been something required by our primate ancestors and perhaps our hunter-gatherer ancestors? Perhaps having those berries, in the late summer, early fall was a a survival mechanism, but man, we sure don't need it now.
Yeah, well said. So I'm getting avoid isolated extracts of pure fructose, or by and large constituted of pure fructose, like, we mentioned agave syrup, high fructose corn syrup. Don't be overweight to the best of your ability, be as far away from a type 2 diabetic as possible. You also mentioned briefly meat and animal products.
Mm-hmm.
What is the relationship between meat and animal products with uric acid in the body? I mean, I believe you're a fan of grass-fed beef, as am I. You and I have shared many a steak over the years. So talk to me about the relationship between animal products.
All whole foods, meaning, not the notion of a food manufacturing company. I mean, what an oxymoron. But whole foods, plants, and animal products contain DNA. They have cells. They contain DNA and they contain RNA. And the breakdown products of the DNA and RNA, things like inosine, monophosphate, et cetera, ultimately, they're called purines, and they ultimately form uric acid. So this is yet another entree into that pathway to make uric acid. So it doesn't mean that a person should necessarily, by virtue of what we're talking about, avoid meat. There are certain meats that are much higher in purines, and they include things like organ meats, liver, kidney, things like anchovies, a lot of Oriental foods that have added taste enhancers like monosodium glutamate, for example. Glutamate does contribute, is a purine, and it contributes to the purine pool rather, and is therefore related to uric acid. This is apart from the discussion, if you will, of MSG having issues with flushing, headaches, and all the MSG symptoms that people may or may not experience. But we do know it contributes to increasing uric acid, and therefore it's something we should revisit. So it's not that I'm saying we need to all avoid meat. What I am saying is looking at our dietary choices through the lens of uric acid, meaning you could be vegan, you can be keto, you can be paleo, you could be, eating meat, but I wouldn't say being on a deeply carnivorous diet, all through the lens of what it's doing to your uric acid level, which is a simple blood test. You can do it at home with a monitor, much as you might measure your blood sugar. So it's something you can be on top of, and you can measure it and determine, well, does it look like now that I've cut fructose, is my uric acid at 5.5 or lower? That's our goal for men and women. 5.5 milligrams per deciliter. Or do I have work to do? Is my uric acid, elevated, in which case I'm at risk for cardiometabolic disease and neurometabolic disease. So I think that's the context in terms of having meat and how much you can have. I eat meat or animal products, and especially fish, but I've really limited my portion size. I keep my uric acid around 4.5 using a monitor. I haven't had one in a doctor's office for quite some time, but again, it's context dependent. So that is another source that can contribute to uric acid, and alcohol as well. Alcohol is metabolized exactly the same as fructose. It is an ATP to AMP energy depletion event, and alcohol shuttles right into the production of uric acid. The good news is that this is really, again, context dependent. What kind of alcohol are you consuming? Wine doesn't seem to have any effect on uric acid in men, and actually looks like it might lower uric acid a little bit in women. Beer, on the other hand, dramatically increases uric acid by two mechanisms. Yes, it contains alcohol, but beer is very rich in purines because it's made from yeast. Yeast is a very small cellular thing that contains a lot of genetic material and provides purines that are then shuttled into uric acid production. To the extent that Japan is now offering purine-free beer.
Wow.
I mean, Japan has several of the references I've quoted have been out of the Japanese literature. They're, dare I say, kind of ahead of the United States in terms of this understanding the role of uric acid. This study was a Japanese study, the paper that said uric acid metabolic disease from innocent bystander to central player. So they're offering up purine-free beer just exactly for that reason. So beer, because of purine and alcohol, stimulating uric acid production, making us fatter, is, now we understand where the beer belly comes from. It's not just from the alcohol, but it's that combination with the purines. Hard liquor does raise uric acid as well. So the recommendation there would be, if you're going to drink wine. Other things to consider is coffee is on the A list, helpful list, which is welcome news. Turns out that dairy products might actually, at least in food frequency questionnaires that looked at what people eat, there does seem to be slightly lower uric acid across the board in people who tend to favor dairy products. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that eating dairy products, therefore, will lower your uric acid. This is an association. But, to me, it means having a little organic whole milk in my coffee is probably going to be okay.
I love that. If you have elevated uric acid levels, what is the hierarchy what should the hierarchy of your approach be? I mean, if you have elevated blood sugar already, if you're overweight, I mean, are you saying that like cutting out meat and alcohol should be the first step, or should it be more about, a dietary and lifestyle intervention that brings your weight down first? Is cutting out organ meats really necessary? I mean, it's one of the, the organ meats are some of the most nutrient dense foods that we have access to. Certainly our ancestors.
So again, and I'm not advocating that. What I am saying is see where your uric acid is and see how it responds. The step one is fructose by far and away. And it is everywhere. Again, 65% of America's foods have added sweetener. And by and large, there's hidden fructose in just about everything in a package these days, including, baby food sweetened with sweetener. So they like it. It's pretty sad, but, it's sodas, it's fruit juice. I mean, I'm talking to you right now from Florida, and it's all about having your 12 ounces of OJ each morning. Wow. Do you really want to consume 36 grams or 16 ounces contains 36 grams of sugar? Is that really what you want to be doing? Think about that and telling your body to prepare for winter. Our hunter-gatherer forebears didn't come upon trees with gallon jugs of orange juice hanging from them. They might find some fruit that had an awful lot of fiber and, not a huge abundance of that. So I think step one is to recognize that it's fructose. The other thing you hinted at that I think is really interesting is, that if people have that are heavy or have high blood sugar, that it tends to make the situation perpetuate itself. Because as I mentioned, having high blood sugar makes more fructose, makes more uric acid, makes more blood sugar. As a survival mechanism, it does everything it can to make you fat. Dr. Johnson, I've talked about his work before. His new book is called Why Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, because that's what we inherited, from all who have come before. This change in the enzyme called uricase that happened around, 14 to 17 million years ago, blocking the function of that enzyme so that our uric acid levels would be now 4 to 5 times higher than many other mammals. So we've got this incredible, but we're not the only ones. I mean, recently it was discovered in looking at the skeleton of Sue, the T-Rex that was found in South Dakota, that she had gout. She had elevated uric acid. And we know that reptiles and birds also have deficiencies of the uricase enzyme and have higher uric acid levels. And you wonder why T-Rex was always so angry. Imagine having your foot at 6 feet long and it's full of gout.
Yeah, poor Sue.
I know, poor Sue. And didn't end well. But that said, again, what we're seeing is this profound mismatch between our evolution and our current environment. And I have to say that my first paper on evolutionary environmental mismatch, I wrote half a century ago when I was 16, actually published in the Miami Herald, saying that, what about the people of today who are living with this outdated machinery? It's outdated because it's not up to task as it relates to our current environment. So, that's sort of the pillar of the paleo movement, isn't it? That we want to try to re-engage or at least emulate the environment of our Paleolithic forebears in order to let our genome do what it wants to do. And that is express genes that keep us healthy and suppress genes that pave the way for not being healthy.
I so appreciate that. So when it comes to controlling uric acid levels, definitely drop the fructose, super important. You mentioned purines though, found in food. Um, as a significant exogenous source of purines, but we also create them in our own bodies. Is that correct?
That's right.
We create purines in our own bodies. So
yeah, in fact, 2/3 of the purines in our bodies actually are a manifestation of the breakdown of our body tissues. So, we have inroads to making uric acid, even if we are completely off of fructose. That sort of sets the baseline of uric acid, and it's when we add to that. Or we have excessive breakdown of our tissues. There is, a situation with, for example, when you are treating a cancerous tumor with radiation or chemotherapy, and that tumor suddenly, it starts to degrade in the human body, that will release tons of purines and uric acid level will go up. Anything that causes us to be catabolic, for example, like prolonged fasting or extreme exercise, going out and running, a marathon, especially if you're not trained, will break down muscle and other tissues and will liberate purines and will transiently raise uric acid levels. So that's why, I think it's really important if you're following your uric acid levels to understand that the night before, it'd be good not to have alcohol. It'd be good to not have engaged the day before in overly strenuous exercise. And, then you'll get a much more much better representation of your uric acid level in terms of what it typically is. I suspect in the future, we'll have technology for monitoring it even through a continuous glucose monitor or some other type of, wearable or something. We'll know our uric acid level. I think it's going to be that important.
Wow. And currently today you can test at home via a finger prick, or do you have to go into
a tiny finger prick? I use a device called UASURE, UASURE, and it's a tiny little finger stick, a little tiny drop of blood. What I found that's really handy is I just stick right on the tip of my thumb, right where the nail is, and squeeze it down first of all, and I hardly feel it. I was never keen on finger sticks. What can I say? But this works, and it's not a big deal.
Super interesting. Is there anything that really surprised you over the course of writing Drop Acid? I mean, obviously you, as a physician, you know a lot about this topic already, but like over the course of researching and writing the book, was there a moment for you that was just like light bulb, mind blown?
Several. I mean, I don't think it's often that we value the importance of contextualizing so many of the things that we are dealing with and teaching and talking about and learning about day in and day out. I mean, our overview of insulin resistance, for example, is that's a bad thing. Elevated blood sugar, gosh, that really is horrible. Gaining body fat, gee, why in the world would you ever want to do that? That's only in the context of our modern day, right? That these were survival mechanisms for our ancestors, primates, Paleolithic times, up until the Neolithic period when we were, really worried about where our food would come from. That was the biggest aha, was to finally take a step back and say, these are not bad things. These are just activations of certain parts of our physiology that are always there, that were cultivated and refined in our genome, expressing itself through these pathways that allowed us to be here today. And that was the biggest aha moment, because we tend to live in the moment saying, oh, these things are so terrible. How could that be? Why in the world would we even have an AMP deaminase that forces us to make fat, raises our blood pressure? That's a horrible thing. We should just get rid of that or suppress it as best we can. Well, I think in today's world, that's true. That's what we ought to be doing. But in the context of, what this meant for our ancestors, let me give you an example. There is a term called Pacific hyperuricemia. And this describes the elevated uric acid that's seen in people who live in Polynesia and Micronesia, where for 3,000 years of these epic voyages from one island to the next, or from mainland to find a new island, that these individuals engaged in, that selected out those individuals with higher uric acid. Why? Because they would have a little bit more body fat, and importantly, they were less likely to become dehydrated. Now, those who didn't have higher levels of uric acid, they wouldn't have made the trip. They would have made the trip, but they wouldn't have completed the trip, right? So they didn't end up at the next island where they could then reproduce and pass on. So it was a very big selection pressure. So now those individuals living in places like Samoa and Bora Bora, all these places have incredibly high levels of obesity and diabetes and all parts of the metabolic syndrome. In fact, the worst on planet Earth. Why? Because in the last 100 years, they've adopted a Western style of diet. They're no longer growing their own food. They're no longer harvesting much from the ocean. And as such, they're eating, prepared or processed foods, higher levels of blood sugar, higher levels of fructose consumption. And look what's happening. So that is just a dramatic representation of this evolutionary environmental mismatch. Here you have an evolutionary pressure that selected out those who had higher uric acid levels. They would make the trip. They wouldn't become as dehydrated. And parenthetically, they were also more resistant to malaria. One of the upsides of higher uric acid is, for whatever reason, it helps reduce your risk of malaria infection. So an interesting tidbit.
That is fascinating. We talked a little bit about fluid and hydration at earlier in the show. So does proper hydration play a role in keeping our uric acid levels in check?
It is huge. And the point is that, again, consuming sodium in and of itself will raise your serum sodium level and will trigger the conversion of glucose into fructose and will raise uric acid. So we want to do everything we can to keep serum sodium levels down. And again, context is really important. If you eat that salty pretzel in and of itself, that's a lot of salt. If you do it with a lot of water, then it's not going to significantly raise your serum sodium level. That's why hydration is so important. It's why higher sodium or consumption of salt, higher salt consumption is associated with obesity and diabetes. It's through this mechanism, which we never understood, the conversion of glucose into fructose and the downstream effect of increasing uric acid. Now, this is news, right? But it's something that cattle farmers have known for a long time. Why do you think they put a salt lick for the cattle? I mean, why are they licking salt? One of the reasons is it makes them fatter. It also helps them reduce risk of some sort of disease they get when they eat grass, some problem. But salt turns on the ability to make fat. And you might say, well, fat people or diabetes patients have higher salt. Isn't that interesting? But it turns out that when you restrict salt, you can, in fact, improve those situations. And you can either restrict salt or you can give more water. One recent study in JAMA, interestingly, was in school children, where school children are really having an issue these days with metabolic problems. And they demonstrated, after a few months of simply putting a water fountain outside of the classroom and encouraging kids to drink versus another group of kids where they did put the water fountain in, there was a 30% reduction in the development of obesity. That's profound. I mean, just by drinking water and helping dilute down their sodium level.
30%. Wow. That is stunning.
And that's a major, major issue for us. I mean, and it's not just the overweight and obesity part of that story. It's the hypertension. 10% of kids between the ages of 12 and 18 have hypertension. That's a big number. I mean, a third of adults, yes, but 10% of children having to take a blood pressure medicine, that's pretty scary.
That is really scary. So what is your hydration routine then? I mean, when you wake up in the morning, what is are you? I
drink coffee and I drink lots of water. And that's relatively new for me. I drink water all day long. As a matter of fact, I have it right here. Just finished. My daughter bought me something, not to drop name brands, but I'm really impressed with. It's called a Corksicle. And what this thing is this great big insulated container, and I can put a few ice cubes in water in this thing, and I will have ice in there for 2 days. It's unbelievable. So I just keep that around and just start drinking water. You end up peeing more. That might be an issue at night, whatever. But it's really worth it. It's really worth it to be super hydrated, I believe.
What about the addition of salt? I mean, are there any instances where, because we've talked about sodium, but a lot of people on low carb diets, people who do things routinely that cause them to sweat vigorously, have an increased need for electrolyte consumption. So there are a lot of products now on the market. We work with a company called Element, which, I really like. I take Element in between I sip it in between my sauna sessions, but I'm sweating profusely in those sauna sessions. Is that something that you would recommend, or in the context of uric acid?
I think it really depends on the person. So Element's going to give you sodium, but also potassium and magnesium, which, are obviously very important, especially if you're a high level athlete or you're in ketosis. Element was originally designed for people who are pursuing a ketogenic diet. But that said, I think that's when you want to do a blood study. You want to see, what is my blood sodium running? Am I running high? What is my response to consuming sodium? But I think that consuming sodium in that way with adequate water consumption, along with that, whatever your product may be, is reasonable. I mean, if you're, in ketosis or doing a lot of saunas, losing sodium, by all means, that's reasonable, but make sure to drink lots and lots of water with it.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I have like a 32 ounce, if not larger, blender bottle that I throw the Element into, and I'm just constantly refilling it with water. And and I find anecdotally, when I, use electrolytes, it doesn't have to be that brand, just in general, after my saunas, I feel invigorated as opposed to depleted.
Yeah. Well, there's something there too, feeling a little bit depleted at times as well. I mean, there's probably an upside to that as a stress, a hormetic stress. But Element is a very straightforward product, providing these really important minerals that so many of us, especially as it relates to magnesium, so many people in the Western world, more so, just don't have adequate magnesium stores. And, that's a major issue as it relates to a host of enzyme reactions for which magnesium plays an important role as what we call a cofactor or facilitator of enzyme functionality. So I'm all in. I think it's a good idea.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one. What is autoimmunity? What are some of the conditions that are associated with autoimmunity, just for people who are unfamiliar with the term?
Yeah, I mean, Jeff, we just want to make it very simple, for kitchen table conversations. Autoimmunity is when your immune system misdirects the immune response when it should be, say, reacting to a pathogen to your own self tissues. And so our immune system is making immunologic targets to, say, our thyroid. And it gets more complex in terms of which targets those are and so forth. But it's a misfire. And so our body knows, or it should know, to not damage the thyroid or not damage the myelin sheath in multiple sclerosis or various tissues of the body. So it's a misdirected immune response. And this occurs due to, there's a lot of etiologies, gut microbiome imbalances, lack of being breastfed early on, whether or not you were birthed naturally or via C-section, which, I came to be very interested in autoimmunity because my daughter was born via C-section. So we did, a lot of things from a microbiome standpoint, and raw goat milk and vitamin D, breastfeeding, of course, to ensure that hopefully we can create a stable ecosystem for her microbiome to then educate her immune system so that later in life she doesn't develop asthma, allergies, atopy, right? Because that early microbiome really helps to educate the immune system, and that education can influence the predisposition of autoimmunity.
Did you guys do like the swabbing, like of the vaginal flora? I know that they're starting to do that now in some places,
which is good. So that research I think came out in like 2015, 2016. My daughter was born in 2012.
Interesting.
But I mean, I wish we would have done that for sure. And thankfully, the breastfeeding and then the raw goat milk, we eat a whole real food diet. She's never had antibiotics, so she doesn't have any issues. Thankfully, she's 9. But I mean, really, as a new parent and people listening, if they're pregnant or have family members that are pregnant, like, you have to be adamant. For example, the placenta and the umbilical cord, they want to snip that right away. And we've now known for like 15 years that if you wait at least, say, 45 seconds on a minimum, up to like a minute or two before you cut that, you can increase the level of iron and ferritin in your baby. And
Wow.
but I remember like the nurse or whoever just went in right away, and I had to like jump in her way, like, whoa, hold up, what are we doing? Like, and yet that research has been known for a long time. So
Wow.
anyway, kind of the lesson that I've learned is you really, like we're talking about with research, you need to advocate for your health, because sometimes these practitioners, they don't know some of the data. But I think, with all that being said, when it comes to autoimmunity, an under-recognized but very important aspect of autoimmunity is how our metabolic system, like our blood sugar handling capacity, our body fat percentage, and hormones that are classically characterized that govern or regulate appetite, sensing, insulin responses, all that, they influence the state of the immune system. So your immune system has all these different cells that can regulate the expression of cytokines and interleukins and T helper cells and all of that. And there's a critical cell type called the T regulatory cell. And for lack of a better analogy, it's sort of like a policeman or a regulator within your immune system. So if there is sort of autoimmune processes occurring, the T reg cell, if you have high levels of that, and we'll talk about what does or doesn't increase levels of T reg cells, that can help to decrease the propensity of facilitating or developing autoimmunity. And in a lot of people, they're overweight, they're insulin resistant, they're eating hyperpalatable, ultra processed junk food. That exacerbates the release of this hormone called leptin. And it turns out that a lot of people have heard about leptin when it comes to overeating and overfeeding. We can define that in a moment. But leptin downregulates these very important protective cells in your immune system called the T reg cells. And that can foster the development of autoimmunity. And so that's probably why, and this is not new research, it's been known since the 90s, why people that are more overweight, why people that are pre-diabetic or diabetic have a higher tendency to develop MS, asthma, allergies, Hashimoto's, and all these different autoimmune conditions, because of the fact that there's all this crossover between these classically considered metabolic hormones and the immune system. And it turns out that leptin, one of the mechanisms through which this happens, and there's probably multiple mechanisms, but a big one is elevated levels of leptin. So to me, I think it's fascinating, because then when we think about, well, okay, say you have Hashimoto's, or say you have MS, or these biomarkers, your RA factors are high, right? What do? We don't really think about, well, exercise or fasting. We think about, you need more curcumin. Well, you need, plant-based diet. Like you need vitamin D, but all helpful, like in certain contexts. But we also need to consider, say, intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding or exercise, because those influence the metabolic side. And so it's hard to disentangle. If we think about classically used a condition that's characterized as an immune dysregulated condition, cancer or autoimmunity, if you give those individuals a drug that's frequently given to diabetics like metformin, those conditions and their levels of inflammatory biomarkers decrease. The inverse is also true. If you give a diabetic a TNF alpha blocker, which is a drug used for, say, ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, their diabetes improves. So there's not really a point of, it's hard to disentangle our so-called metabolism or the energy sort of regulatory system of the body from our immune system. They're really two sides of the same coin. And I know it gets complex because this field is characterized as immuno-metabolism, sort of the synthesis of these two marrying, or the conjoining of these two disparate conditions or fields, but it really lends itself to lifestyle medicine and therapy. When we think about, okay, well, how can we approach our asthma? What's the pill for asthma? It's like, well, it's multifactorial, right? What do I do for allergies? Well, you have to consider blood sugar regulate, having all these, blood glycemic variability is not going to help your allergies or your asthma or your psoriasis or your gut, right? So I think it helps us to blend these things together too. And if we think about people that have blood sugar issues, then we can also say, well, yeah, your curcumin or gut health can help support that blood sugar issue that you have, the prediabetes that you have, because of this, this immunometabolic model. And I think it's really timely. It's been known for a long time, but it gets complex. And so people don't think, if they have autoimmunity, to measure their leptin, or they don't think they need to measure their blood glucose or their hemoglobin A1C. So like, well, I don't have diabetes, so why would I even consider? But they're the same thing, right? There's underlying or shared mechanisms. And to me, I think it's awesome, because if someone is struggling to resolve their, I know psoriasis or rosacea can be challenging. People get flares. It affects their social life. Have joint pain, like all that can be debilitating. And it's like, once they've done all the diet stuff, the elimination diet, they're taking all the supplements, like, well, what else can I do? time to focus on improving blood sugar health and mitochondrial health and all that.
Absolutely. I want to take a step back and talk about leptin. So leptin is secreted primarily by the fat tissue, correct? And so what are the conditions? What are the dietary, what's the dietary pattern, the lifestyle conditions that would lead a person to having chronically elevated levels of leptin?
Yeah, this is a phenomenal question here, and we should have talked about this earlier. So leptin released from your adipocytes, your fat tissue. Normally what it does is it helps us stimulate satiety. So it increases our levels of satiety, and it oscillates on a circadian rhythm. So it's lowest in the morning and actually around 11 a.m. So that's where I'm more of a fan of time-restricted feeding, because it seems that from a evolutionary teleologically standpoint and hormonally, we should be feeding then in the morning. And then it progressively increases to its peak, when we're sleeping. And so it's designed to help us not wake up and want to go to the refrigerator and get some cookies or whatever, right? But what happens is as you become more insulin resistant and more overweight, you get more and more fat cells. You get like billions of these fat cells. Like if you just gain 10 pounds and if you were to quantify or equate that to the amount of new fat cells you're getting, it's in the orders of magnitude. Like it's insane. And so all those fat cells start to release this adipocytokine. So it used to be called an adipokine because it's released from fat tissue, but it's now known as a cytokine as well. And that then just overloads the receptor in the brain in the hypothalamus. So people then, even though they have enough energy in the form of fat, the brain perceives that just like, your muscle tissue will, if you get insulin resistant, your muscles ignore the message of insulin. Your brain starts to ignore the message of leptin. So that creates this phenomenon where people are overweight, but they're still hungry because they have hypothalamic leptin resistant. And so in metabolically healthy people, you or I, or a lot of people listening, they know that after they've had dinner, they're good. Like they don't need to continue to eat because they have leptin sensitivity. But as we become overweight, and those cut points in terms of body fat percentage are different based upon gender. So in women, hyperinsulinemia and hyperleptinemia start to occur around 25% body fat. For men, it's about 20%. Now everyone's a little bit different, based upon their muscle mass and all of that, but those are rough cut points to consider. And then what happens is because leptin is also involved in suppressing these immune cells and driving inflammation, it directly increases these pro-inflammatory mediators like interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha. So not only are you hungry all the time, and then you have irraverent, crazy, cravings and all that, but then you get more inflammation. So you get this smoldering background inflammation that can exacerbate all of these chronic health conditions, increase risk of developing autoimmunity and other diseases that are linked with inflammation. So yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Now, if you just, fast for a couple of days, you drop your leptin very quickly. And so this is where metabolic therapies and even exercise. So if we think about where does leptin bind to, in addition to the brain, it also binds to skeletal muscle. And so the more muscle mass we have, the more sensitive we will be to leptin and have lower levels of leptin. So I encourage all my clients to walk, to squat, to lunge, to hip thrusts, and do these things because the legs have a lot of leptin receptors, more so than the upper body for whatever reason. This was some research out of Denmark that I looked at this. So to me, I think it's really fascinating. But leptin and insulin sort of crosstalk. And so if someone is insulin resistant, they might also be leptin resistant. There's a lot of co-stimulation of these different hormones. Last thing I'll add on that, and then if you have any further questions, is when you test leptin, just like when you test your testosterone, you want to repeat test during the same time of the day. So for example, if a male goes in and tests his testosterone at 4:00, it might be lower, or it will be lower than it normally would be in the morning because these hormones oscillate on a circadian rhythm basis. So you got to consider that in context when you are going to test this. So I've had people say, well, I tested my leptin levels and it was normal and they were obese. Well, when did you get tested? Well, it was a different time of the day. So it's really important if you're going to test your leptin levels, you either want to be consistent with first thing in the morning to see it should be low, or later in the day and retest during those same time periods. So you're comparing apples to apples.
Fascinating. Isn't leptin also considered a metabolic master regulator? So for somebody who's chronically dieting, hasn't there been, at least in the fitness community, this idea that with frequent dieting or prolonged dieting, that there's a benefit to eating foods that are going to spike leptin, usually like high glycemic carbohydrates or starches, things like that?
I don't know. I'm not aware of that research. I'm aware of the so-called adaptive thermogenesis, where when you diet, you lose a bunch of weight and then your metabolic rate slows down so that it makes it harder to sort of keep the weight off. But I haven't seen that. Maybe is it that carb refeeding?
Yeah, essentially carb refeeding.
Carb backloading and things like that.
And that obviously plays a number of different roles, like you're refilling your glycogen stores, but also and I'm just sort of like trying to recall what the lore that I've just through osmosis acquired over the past 2 decades of being interested in fitness, that there's this idea that when you're in a prolonged calorie deficit, that leptin decreases, becomes suppressed. And then there's a potential benefit, because when it's suppressed, it also reduces your metabolic rate to then like spiking it, and I'm not sure how much you can spike, the degree to which you can spike leptin, with a single meal. But that's just something that I've heard.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Honestly, I haven't dove into that.
As good practice. I don't know. That's super interesting. So then the relationship between leptin and autoimmunity.
Yeah.
This is fascinating.
It's super fascinating because, again, just to recap sort of what we talked about with the immune system, the cell type that's really important in regulating autoimmunity and asthma and all that is the T regulatory cell.
Right.
And this is emerging in various autoimmune diseases, whether it manifests as Crohn's or colitis or RA or MS or whatever, the T reg cells are frequently found to be very low. And so therefore that allows this sort of runaway inflammation and misbehaving of all these other immune cells. And it turns out that there's a direct relationship between leptin levels and the functionality of these T reg cells. Higher leptin and in the states of hyperleptinemia that we've been talking about in maybe morbidly obese or even overweight individuals, that tends to inhibit the functionality of these important cells.
Wow.
So that is the relationship between this so-called immuno-metabolism, where you might develop overweightness, obesity, insulin resistance just by not exercising, not prioritizing food, and then you develop this autoimmune condition, and the mechanism there could be driven, and the research hints at this, by leptin. It's also linked with more aggressive breast cancer, more aggressive prostate cancer. So it's not just autoimmunity, it's also, crosses over to cancers, and that could be part of the reason. We've heard a lot about how, glucose and insulin and mTOR and growth factors exacerbate or worsen cancers, but it could also be that the cancerous cells themselves are able to evade the immune system because the T reg cells are not there, and this crosstalk with leptin. So to me, I think it's fascinating because it gives us another tool in the toolbox to prioritize exercise and intermittent fasting and low carb nutrition and all of that, which I think is oftentimes neglected, when we think about classical management of autoimmune disorders.
Absolutely. We love our T reg cells. Aren't there also micronutrient deficiencies that are associated with having lower levels of T reg cells?
Well, vitamin D plays a big role there. There's some research on vitamin A and probiotics. I'm sure there's other micronutrients. I just haven't done
Vitamin D is a big one.
Huge.
Yeah. I feel like vitamin D, there was a meta-analysis that I cited in the Genius Life, where it was the only vitamin that there was enough evidence to warrant clinical usage of vitamin D in multiple sclerosis.
Wow.
Yeah. Very
That's
interesting.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's huge. I mean, I've seen miracles. I used to work with a medical doctor in Denver, and from sleep issues, from autoimmune issues, depression. I mean, the list goes on of like all these different conditions where vitamin D has been shown to be helpful. So I think now it's getting more airtime, like kind of with all the COVID stuff, which is good. But a lot of people still think, well, like in LA right now, like it's pretty sunny out. But if you're, south of Atlanta, Georgia, even between October and March, the zenith angle of the sun is not, even if you're out in the sun, which we all want to do for circadian rhythms and all that, it's not enough to cause endogenous vitamin D synthesis on the skin to create that pre-vitamin D. So, it's good still to supplement, especially if you're not getting full body sun exposure between, now and say March.
Yeah, I'd kind of fallen off the vitamin D supplementation bandwagon just prior to having COVID, and then I started supplementing while I had COVID, and I've just stayed on it, and it's amazing how much better I feel.
That's awesome.
Getting those 5,000 IUs every day.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, autoimmunity, man.
It's frustrating for a lot of people, and I think it's a condition for which mainstream medicine, as good as it can be for managing all these different conditions, they run out of tools pretty quickly, right? Because people are on biologics or prednisone and steroids, and there's a lot of complications or side effects. So the more that we can manage these conditions naturally with exercise, with compressing feeding windows, I think it lends itself to just less damage on the body.
Yeah. From a dietary standpoint, what are your thoughts on like lectin avoidance and the quote unquote Gundry diet? Making sure that, because I feel like a lot of the people who claim to see benefit from a more sort of stringent lectin avoidance diet tend to be people with autoimmune conditions.
Right. I've seen that as well. I recommend that quite frequently. Like I do consultations still. A lot of my people that have autoimmune issues that don't go away. I used to make fun of the carnivore diet. I recommend that, initially, at least just to see what it's going to do, to rule out, okay, is it these hidden anti-nutrients that are in the tomatoes that you love? Or could it be that, you're getting these changes within your microbiome from the soil, whatever it is, right? So it's easy just to wipe that out for the elimination and then slowly reintroduce things like olives, avocado, healthier, plant foods that have a lower probability. So yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that approach, especially for autoimmunity, which I know a lot of people, I mean, it creates a sort of, mental gymnastics because we know that, well, having just meat and animal fat, you're like, what about the microbiome? What about endotoxin? What about all these problems? But the people that I've worked with generally do pretty well when they do that approach. And it may not be forever. But yeah, it's interesting because forever, you and I have, kind of got into this, right when the microbiome project was taking off, and we heard so much about fiber and fermentable foods and polyphenols and all these things being so supportive of the microbiome. Yet you have these people go off those things, and their autoimmune conditions can oftentimes get better. Not in every situation, but I think it's worth considering for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, I think that for a person with a fully functional immune system that is not under some kind of autoimmune, that's not having active autoimmunity, I think that these quote unquote stressed plants and these xenobiotic compounds, phytochemicals that we find in wild and organic plants, are only going to strengthen the system. Yeah. But the reality is that many of us are born, going back to the beginning of our talk, are born via C-section. They're not breastfed. They, are born in these hyper sterilized environments. Dude, what about the children that were born last year?
I worry all the time for that. I mean, my goodness, I don't know.
Right? Like, I mean, last year was hygiene theater, like if anything else, right? Yeah. It was the year of hygiene theater. So imagine all the kids that were born during that period. And just like, in the time of hand sanitizer, like their parents are just putting hand sanitizer everywhere, masks everywhere. It's just like, yeah, I think that we're going to see like a lot of immune dysfunction coming up in the coming decades.
It's pretty scary. I mean, if you look at the rates of obesity in kids, I mean, that has dramatically increased. But yeah, I mean, my daughter's she's in fourth grade now. And I pick her up from school, and the parents that I see pushing the kids, sometimes they often have masks on outdoors in a stroller. And a lot of kids it's crazy, Max, they have hand sanitizer on their backpack. A lot of the teachers, for third graders, they have the big, 5-gallon jug or whatever, hand sanitizer. So the kids are getting the hand sanitizer when they go into the classroom.
Jeez.
So yeah, it's, I think the pendulum always moves. And I feel like with Robin Chutkan and all these different doctors that were talking about like eat clean, live dirty, with regards to the human microbiome and play outside and all that. It's like we've completely forgotten about that with regards to COVID. And so it's unfortunate that there's going to be some unintended harms, and these kids might experience unnecessarily these conditions. But I don't know how we get through these people, because they perceive the threat of COVID obviously to be worse for their family than potential autoimmunity down the road.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Identical twins, so everything should be the same about them, right? And they found that when one twin had the bacteria cascade associated with obesity and insulin resistance versus a healthy kind of what's deemed to be healthy cascade in identical twins eating the same exact diet, the twin with the quote fat bacteria more prevalent gained weight while the other one did not, eating the exact same diet.